Hello and welcome back to No Bullshit. Today we return to talking about the latest season of Family Guy. Last time we checked in with them, Peter and the family were ripping on President Trump and his family, really hardcore, with some old played out jokes and some that are even based on now debunked facts. Pathetic. Regardless, that's not the kind of political we're going to get into today on this new episode. This time, Peter Griffin is going transgender. Why, you might ask? Well, Family Guy is retreading some of the oldest and most tired jokes once again about transgenderism. This time they're goofing on transgender bathrooms and people taking advantage of this privilege in 2019. And I hate to say it right out the gate, but this is something South Park, of course, joked about 5 years ago in 2014. But let's not be too hasty in our judgment of the Family Guy episode yet. There's still a few laughs here and some good points in there too. It's just buried under Family Guy's growing liberal bias. I'll try and sift through it for you though and do the best I can to explain this new episode. Things start off with Peter winning baseball tickets for him and his friends. The Boston Red Sox gave them season tickets for creating the best fan-made commercial for the team in a contest they held. Peter won by simply taking a dump in a New York Yankees helmet. Simple but effective. And a little play on the baseball rivalry there. New York versus Boston is a historic rivalry between a number of their teams and also just with the people and their accents. Regardless, the guys in their day at the ballpark is what leads to the main plot of the story. You see, after a few beers at the game, Peter quickly needs to use the restroom. Unfortunately, there's a giant line at the men's room. This, of course, is not uncommon at big sporting events like this. Peter's too impatient to wait in line though, so he tries the women's restroom instead. That doesn't work out either though, so eventually, Peter tries a third bathroom with a different logo, one he's never seen before. Actually, Peter thinks it looks like the artist formerly known as Prince's logo, but as it turns out, and as you might have guessed, it's actually a transgendered bathroom logo, at least a joke version of it.
A bathroom for Prince? I can't use that. I'm not Prince.
It's not for Prince.
Space cats? I'm not a space cat.
Unfortunately for Peter, though, the crew at Fenway Park caught him coming out of the transgender bathroom. They're not upset about this, though. Quite the opposite, actually. They even end up putting Peter on the Jumbotron, so the whole stadium can see what they think is their first transgender fan. Apparently, the Boston Red Sox just built that bathroom, and they were waiting to see if someone would finally use it. And this whole scenario may play out pretty quickly in the show, but I think there's a lot more significance to it that we could go over here for a minute. First, let's talk about the most obvious. The fact that this baseball team is virtue signaling about having their first transgender fan. This is pretty much what's been happening in more liberal and progressive areas for years now. First transgender TV stars, trans models in shows, and trans movies even. This trans trend has been picking up steam year after year for a while now, and the way this baseball team in the show does it is obviously a play on that as well. It also shows the contrast between areas where this is becoming common. It's common to be trans in places like Los Angeles, Hollywood, and California versus the locations of the show where it's uncommon, which is usually locations in the New England area. Typically in Family Guy, they base their episodes in Quahog, which isn't too far from the home of the actual Red Sox team, Boston, Massachusetts. So them seeing their first transgender there in 2019 tells us a few things. And first of all, it brings up some questions to me. Is this transgender craze really as natural and widespread throughout all the world, like what the left-wingers and SJWs would have you believe? Or perhaps it's a more regional, social, and psychological phenomenon, meaning there are many trans in places like Los Angeles and Thailand because it's trendy and cool and hip there. Perhaps those biological and scientific studies on this aren't what the left-wingers would have you believe. Either way, there's not really enough time in the day to fully dissect all the sides of this. I could make a whole video series about transgenderism, but for now, I think just raising these questions makes the point enough already for today. I will admit there's another side to this too, before we move on. Boston is way more old school and religious than most areas of the country. Catholicism is still very dominant there, so it is possible there would be more transgenders coming out if the area weren't so religious and against it. And I really wish Family Guy did take the time to explore these kinds of themes and ideas more, but as I said before, they only briefly brush over this whole section. Most people watching wouldn't even have enough time to think twice about things like this, but fortunately, I do control my show here, and I could pause and shift and focus on whatever we want. Enough for this bit for now though. Let's move on with the Family Guy episode. The next day after the baseball game, Peter returns to work to find that his bosses are pretty excited and welcoming about him being transgender now. They saw him accidentally come out on TV, and before Peter could tell them that he's really not trans, his bosses immediately start talking about the company's transgender benefits package. This gets Peter interested, so he decides to play along and see how he can benefit from this.
Well, in the words of trailblazer Caitlyn Jenner, I will do anything for money and attention.
So brave.
Here we get a rather dated Caitlyn Jenner joke, but it is still admittedly relevant and interesting. Peter is pretty much directly admitting he's going transgender for money and attention, like what most would think Caitlyn Jenner did. And I have to say I agree too. And this is a good joke that digs in on this new fad. As we went over before, this new wave of transgenders going public is growing by the day, and many could also say a lot of this started when Bruce Jenner transitioned, while he was appearing on the reality TV show Keeping Up with the Kardashians. This happened around 2014, and it was a very public transition that got him a lot of attention. The newly anointed Caitlyn Jenner became the talk of the town back then, getting press, interviews, awards, and even her own short-lived reality show starring herself. So sure, this Family Guy bit now may seem a little late to the party. As I said earlier, South Park covered these issues at the time, but you got to admit too, the transgender trend is still going on, so it's still relevant. And the way Peter goes trans to get attention here is very likely to be the same reasons other popular trans people are doing it to this day. Now, I'm not going to name names or anything, but there are also a number of big trans YouTubers right now who are still riding off this wave, which undoubtedly was started by Caitlyn Jenner in 2014. Again, not naming names, but I'm sure if you've been on YouTube for a while recently, you've seen the number of transgender YouTubers popping up all the time. Because much like how the Boston Red Sox and Peter's company in this episode, how they're super stoked to jump in on this trans bandwagon, so too is YouTube the company this way in the real world. Next, the family has a discussion about Peter's newfound transgenderness. Back at the house, Lois warns Peter that him trivializing transgenderism to get time off work is wrong. Brian even chimes in with his typical bleeding heart liberal bullshit too. He says Peter is taking advantage of a civil liberty which many oppressed people fought their whole lives for. And while this is all true and what Peter's doing is wrong, also Peter is proving that the current system is wrong about this too. Glorifying and propping up trans people just because is not the way to go either. I think treating them like everyone else should be the actual goal here. You know, equality, but that's not really the SJW way, is it? So Peter gaming the system actually exposes the downsides of glorifying transgenders. And it's also a display of a real actual bad result of all this liberal philosophy too. Family Guy may be seen as an over-the-top comedy that's making a pretty obvious joke with this here, but people pretending to be trans like this is also a real thing that happens every day. More than you think it does, actually. And I think people need to realize that fact as much as the rest of this stuff, really. Next, Peter decided he wants to dress the part too, so he goes and gets a female makeover. Now he's got long hair, a dress, and makeup on, so Peter decides to immediately go out and take advantage of the new privileges he has for being a, quote, woman. And first thing, right out the gate, Peter goes to tell people mean, disturbing things since he no longer has to worry about getting hit or beat up for it. You can never hit a woman, right? So now Peter takes advantage of that immediately, mostly for his amusement though. And later, he uses even more of his new woman perks, like being able to go out and have wine at lunch with the ladies, while also quietly farting. Then Peter also goes to a karaoke night because now that he's a woman, he can lean in and take over other people's songs. These privileges, of course, do reflect real parts of our actual society. Women may like to pretend they're being punished or oppressed all the time, but really, females in America have more privileges like this than they would ever admit. So whether it's because they're in denial or it's really just never enough for them, any woman who claims she wants more privileges because of equality is really just full of it. Things don't end up too well for Peter though. The karaoke night actually ended rather badly when Pete hits his head and ends up in a hospital. Wouldn't have been that bad either, but he was telling everyone he's transgender now, and well, the hospital decided to give him his transition surgery while he was knocked out already from hitting his head. Yeah, Peter got his Peter cut off and turned into a weird fake vajayjay. So needless to say, the Family Guy is very surprised here. But as his family quickly says later, this is his fault really for pretending to be someone he's not. And I can't help but think about the real people this might have happened to. In different ways, sure, but there's definitely got to be some people in similar boats to Peter in the real world. People who lied and pretended to be trans in order to get benefits. Then they were forced to go so far with it they had to go and do God knows what. Whether it's getting a surgery or taking hormone pills or whatever. Many transgenders have to face this kind of crazy, uncomfortable, life-changing situation eventually. And in a way, it's not all their fault either. Society and the public, namely the social justice warriors and leftists, they're the ones propping up this stuff, and they're also partly to blame here because they're the ones who have incentivized this behavior in the first place. And the left is incentivizing crazy, life-changing, out-of-your-mind behavior so much that people are getting their junk cut off. Ouch. In the end, Peter runs into Quagmire's father, who of course had famously transitioned into a woman years ago on the Family Guy show. So actually, to be truthful or accurate, this isn't Family Guy's first foray into addressing the transgender issue, but this is the first time it was brought up in relation to people going trans for attention and benefits. And while Peter is able to easily get his surgery reversed at the end of the episode here, which turns him back into a man, but many other trans trenders out there in the real world won't be able to reverse their treatments that easily, or ever at all. So yeah, although Family Guy briefly went over most of the real and important issues here, I will admit that this episode did explore it enough to get us talking about things. What do you guys think? Was Family Guy late to the party on this issue? Do you think they meant to imply that people are pretending to be trans a lot in the real world? And what do you think about social justice warriors incentivizing being transgender in the public? Is that a good or very bad thing? Comment your thoughts on everything below, and thanks for watching No Bullshit. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and make sure you subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see y'all next time.